I simulated 1 million US presidential elections. What did I learn? Not much, to be honest. But besides becoming slightly addicted to Excel, I did come up with some interesting timelines. This is what, why, how, and that's what the video's about. If you like this sort of thing, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out patreon.com/whatwhyhow for early access to future videos. Okay. What the heck am I talking about? I have designed an American election simulator in Excel. In this timeline, the moderate Dems and liberal Republicans swap back and forth for 80 years. But when people get bored and a populist party springs up in 1988, the Republicans shift conservative, outflanking the Democrats. The left is so shocked by this abandonment that they create a socialist party. But the far right gets jealous and creates a patriot party to balance that. So America doesn't have a two-party system, but a five-party system between the far-left socialists, the moderate-left populists, the conservative Democrats and the Republicans, and the far-right Patriot Party, and probably about a dozen other minor third parties. In 2044, the populists win with just 27.4% of the vote. Here's one timeline where the Federalist Party, that Federalist Party, survived until 1852, when it causes a civil war and gets replaced by the anti-immigrant American Party. But then the American Party gets beaten up by a British invasion and rebrands as the Democrats. The Jeffersonian Republicans, meanwhile, last until 1952, when the United States loses World War II. The Democrats guide the nation as a liberal party for several cycles until the far-right Patriot Party pops up, probably to oppose civil rights legislation or something. They win office in a landslide election in 1980 and implement a far-right platform in 1984. The Democrat versus Patriot duopoly explodes in 2048 when the Socialist Party wins office. Here's one timeline very close to ours, where the South seceded just 8 years earlier for whatever reason, allowing the Whig Party to survive as the party that won the Civil War and saved the nation, until they get caught holding the hot potato during the Great Depression and explode into dust. In this chaotic timeline, the Federalists lost a civil war during the 1804 election, but the Whigs come in and triumphantly reunify the nation. The Jeffersonian Republicans and Whigs exchange power until 1856, when a major scandal reveals the Whigs were seeking British help to crush domestic slavery. The Whigs die and are replaced by the conservative National Party, and soon the liberal anti-slavery pro-farmer agrarian party springs up too. No party can claw enough support to win re-election for decades. In the 1920s, our returning cast members, the Socialist and the Patriot Party, pop back up onto the scene. The Patriots win in 1924, win a war, win office again, win another war, but somehow lose the 1932 election to the new Liberal Party. In 1976, the Socialists claw their way to the White House, but get the country invaded by some stronger foreign power. The Patriots win office, but trigger a civil war, and the Liberals return to office in a gigantic landslide. Only the Patriots survive, beginning a two-party system that lasts far into the future between the far-right Patriots and the Liberals, who are, in fact, liberal most of the time. And here's one timeline where absolutely nothing interesting happens. Instead, the moderate Federalists and the moderate Democrats just swap back and forth over the decades, at most becoming a little more liberal or a little more conservative. I wonder if the people in that timeline got bored of existing politics and then created their own Excel election simulations. But what is going on behind the scenes? What the hell am I doing with my time? Okay, over here on the left are the election years, starting with 1796, the first contested presidential election since George Washington decided to skedaddle and his heirs began to feud for power. The incumbent party is, of course, the Federalist Party, since that was Washington's not-so-secret loyalty, which I've plugged in as conservative, as opposed to the more liberal Jeffersonian Republicans, aka the Democratic Republicans. Just like real life, it is John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson. Here we can see the approval for Federalist policies on day one of Washington's second term, which we can estimate to be around 53%, based not on Washington's performance, but instead the performance of the Federalists in the House elections. Okay, now what? Well, now the math happens. Based on a formula and a random number generated with some bias toward negativity, the Federalists have an election day popularity. That then influences how they perform in the presidential election, whether they lose or they win. But there are, of course, several more factors that plug into the election results. Chief other one is ideology. So, I've divided America into 7 main ideologies which grow or shrink over time depending on mostly the performance of the president. Those ideologies are revolutionary, progressive, liberal, moderate, conservative, nationalist, or authoritarian. Now obviously this is a major simplification. In real life everything is much more complicated, ideologies aren't really on a left to right scale if you think about it, and also the meaning of ideologies change over time, and it's impossible to actually determine the ideological breakdown of the country back in 1796, let alone really today, because one person's liberal is another person's moderate is another person's conservative. But for the sake of the formula, I've divided the country in 1796 into roughly 3 equal buckets: liberal, moderate, and conservative, with some droplets to the other ideologies. So what does this mean for the 1796 election? Nothing really, because the Jeffersonian Republicans and the Federalists can divide the country pretty evenly between liberal, conservative, and they divide the moderates between them. So instead what matters more is presidential performance, and since John Adams just cannot continue the majesty of George Washington, he loses more often than not. Now I could fiddle it around a little bit to give him a bonus, but I think it's more realistic if he loses more often even though he won in real life. It was, after all, a very close election.
Never in my life have I heard a man speak more like a fool.
Sir?
Okay, but in this timeline, more often than not, Thomas Jefferson becomes president. Then what? Well, then the cycle begins again. Jefferson has an ideology, which for the sake of the calculator is liberal for his era. He also has a day one popularity based on his election performance and some other factors. And then he faces a crisis. Crises sometimes happen randomly, but are more likely in certain years. Crises can tank a president's approval rating, boost it if he handles it well, or completely destroy his party. If a party just dies with a whimper, like the real-life Federalist Party, then new parties will appear, for example the Whig Party. If those parties get split apart by a crisis, like the real-life Whig Party, then more parties will appear. I've plugged in a bunch of possible parties into the simulation, including the Nativist American Party, the Democratic Party, the Whig Party, the Lincoln Republicans, the Populists, and so on. Parties can also appear if certain ideologies just aren't satisfied by the current parties. So if all the revolutionaries or the progressives stay home over and over again because the existing parties are too moderate or conservative, they will create a socialist party, which will start competing in the elections. Here's another interesting thing I've plugged in. Radical parties are more likely to cause crises as they implement their radical policies. Sometimes that's recession, sometimes that's civil wars, sometimes that's foreign wars, which they may win or they may lose. If a radical party gets in power and keeps its radical core, it will try to forge a dictatorship. This can either fail, which causes a civil war and the destruction of the party, or succeed, in which case they get a major boost to their popularity thanks to the suppression of opposition. In this timeline, the Patriot Party pops into the scene after the Civil War as a right-wing opposition to the Jeffersonian Republicans. America has a pretty tough 20th century, suffering an invasion, a depression, and a recession around 1970. In 1984, the Patriots win re-election against the Liberal Democrats, and they decide to crack down and implement a dictatorship. But a civil war buckles their strength, and they lose power in 1996. But they don't disappear. Instead, they win back office in 2016 and 2036, implementing brief dictatorships both times. So in this timeline, America is cursed with a permanently powerful coup party, and the Democrats are completely ineffective to stop them. But more often than not, radical parties moderate over time to try to win more moderate voters. Party ideologies are dynamic. What does that mean? Well, certain parties are coded to pop up with certain ideologies, and others are coded to always lean a certain way, like the Socialist Party. But I've typed up the formulas so that ideologies shift over time based on 3 factors. The first is slight random change, as parties shift leaders and platforms over time. The second is shifting toward whichever faction makes up the majority of the party's voters. So if a conservative party has a conservative ideology, their strongest base will be conservatives, so they'll stay around there. But if they win in a landslide election and gain a bunch of liberals, then they might shift in the moderate direction to appease their new supporters who are more moderate. But the third factor is parties shift toward whichever ideological faction has the lowest satisfaction with the last election's parties. So that means if a bunch of authoritarians stayed home, then the parties will shift in the rightward direction to try to win their votes. But if a bunch of revolutionaries stayed home, the parties will shift in the leftward direction. So they shift back and forth over time to try to maximize the amount of votes they get. Now, of course, they're not actually intelligent. This is just in the formula, but that's what it ends up being. The largest overall factor, of course, however, is the party's previous ideology. That way parties don't flip-flop all over the place, but instead gradually shift over time, committed to their original plank, unless there's a crisis, in which case more energy is injected into the random number generator. Here's an interesting result from all of this formula crap. Sometimes Americans are trapped in a moderate hellhole for decades, as both parties just linger in the middle of the aisle trying to suck up all the votes they can. Imagine Gilded Age politics, but in this scenario, when one party gets a boost of energy and shifts in a radical direction, the other party also does the same thing in the opposite direction. For example, if the Socialist Party pops up, it wins all the leftists. The other party, since it loses all the support it had among progressives and the far left, it then shifts to the right. Once this new dynamic of a far left versus far right party is established, an interesting new phenomenon happens. If the left-wing party moves farther to the left, the right-wing party moves toward the center to take their ground. But if one party moves toward the center, the other party shifts toward the radical position to gain lost ground. That is, if they're both ideologically coded parties, like the Socialist Party or the Patriot Party. If two regular parties spring up and they get radical, they seem to eventually shift back toward the center unless the cycle repeats. So they kind of wave back and forth in a synchronized dance, pushing and pulling to try to maximize their votes. If I didn't code the Socialist Party to always lean left based off the fact it's a Socialist Party, then it would just become a moderate party just like the others, as its original ideological mission would be diluted by electioneering over time. Maybe that's more realistic, but once a party is committed to leaning in a particular political direction, literally by me typing in -2 in their formula, its political nemesis will inevitably lean the other way to gain unrepresented voters on the opposite side of the aisle. What about party swaps? Party swaps, as in a liberal party becoming conservative and vice versa, are not rare, especially when parties last longer than a century, since of course there's more time for them to evolve in that case. Party swaps tend to happen when both parties are moderate and are vibrating back and forth at the political center. Sometimes one jumps a little bit too far and they swap. Now, in all the times I've refreshed Excel to get new results, which is probably thousands of times at this point, I've never seen an ideologically committed party swap with another ideologically committed party. By this I mean I've never seen the Socialist Party become conservative. On the other hand, the Republican Party has become conservative plenty of times in this simulation, even though they're coded to start as a liberal party in the first place. For example, in this timeline, the Democrats are a moderate conservative party, and the Republicans start off as a moderate liberal party until 2000, probably because a national crisis adds energy into the system, at which point they swap. In this timeline, the Democrats and Republicans swap ideologies several times. The Republicans start off as liberals in 1904, then become moderate conservatives in the 1950s, liberals in the 1970s and 80s, then conservatives again until the 2050s when they become moderate liberals again. Now this is only a little bit more strange than real life since we are talking about 150 years of evolution here. Here's another thing. I have it coded so that if a president of a certain ideology performs poorly, all other ideologies increase in their support. So if Obama does bad, then the socialist and the radical right and the conservatives all improve in their support. Since so many presidents are moderate though, and most presidents disappoint their supporters, moderates always shrink as a portion of the population. But moderate presidents keep getting elected because they can win both liberals and conservatives. This is something that is probably not very realistic, judging from the fact that a lot of people in real life are moderate. But then again, we really only have real life to compare to, and real life might be a strange timeline. We don't know. So what did we learn? I learned that hitting the refresh key on your computer hoping for some interesting new party to pop up is kind of like playing a slot machine. Another reason why the simulation is so addictive is because there are always ways to improve it. The whole thing about dictatorships, I thought up while writing the script. And then now here I am at 11:50 p.m., much later than I thought I'd be recording this video. Now, of course, all this stuff is a product of all the formulas that I've put into Excel, a product of intelligent design. Real life is much more complicated, and I might be wrong on stuff. The variables and the formulas I've plugged in are not necessarily a perfect or even especially flawless portrayal of how real life politics works. If I had millions of hours and infinite data, maybe I could make it more and more precise. But I think this is probably a good jumping off point to generate not just interesting alternate history timelines for videos, but also new theories about how elections work that we can then go test using real world data. But that's a video for another day. If you have any interesting ideas or observations, comment them down below. And if you like this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out patreon.com/whatwhyhow to get early access to the next video. Thanks to those who already support the channel, and adios.